let's read from Mark chapter 11, beginning in verse 12, and we're going to read on down through verse 33. The next morning, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. He noticed a fig tree in full leaf a little way off, so he went over to see if he could find any figs. But there were only leaves because it was too early in the season for fruit. Then Jesus said to the tree, "May no one ever eat your fruit again." And the disciples heard him say it. When they arrived back in Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people buying and selling animals for sacrifices. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace. He said to them, "The Scriptures declare, 'My temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have turned it into a den of thieves." When the leading priests and teachers of religious law heard what Jesus had done, they began planning how to kill him. They were afraid of him because the people were so amazed at his teaching. That evening, Jesus and the disciples left the city. The next morning, as they passed by the fig tree he had cursed, the disciples noticed it had withered from the roots up. Peter remembered what Jesus had said to the tree on the previous day and exclaimed, "Look, Rabbi, the fig tree you cursed has withered and died." Then Jesus said to the disciples, "Have faith in God. I tell you the truth, you can say to this mountain, 'May you be lifted up and thrown into the sea,' and it will happen. But you must really believe it will happen and have no doubt in your heart. I tell you, you can pray for anything, and if you believe that you've received it, it will be yours. But when you are praying, first forgive anyone you are holding a grudge against, so that your Father in heaven will forgive your sins too." Again, they entered Jerusalem. As Jesus was walking through the temple area, the leading priests and teachers of religious law and the elders came up to him. They demanded, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you the right to do them?" "I'll tell you by what authority I do these things if you answer one question." Jesus replied, "Did John's authority to baptize come from heaven, or was it merely human? Answer me." They talked it over among themselves. "If we say it was from heaven, he will ask why we didn't believe John. But if we dare say it was merely human, but do we dare say it was merely human?" For they were afraid of what the people would do, because everyone believed that John was a prophet. So they finally replied, "We don't know." And Jesus responded, "Then I won't tell you by what authority I do these things." There's a lot packed in here. Let's dive right in. I want to talk about who is this guy, Jesus. If you remember all the way back to Mark chapter 1, so 10 weeks ago as we began this journey in this gospel, Mark lays it out right in front of us, for us, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. We've heard Peter's proclamation that Jesus is the Messiah. But the question all along is, what does that mean for Jesus to be the Messiah? What kind of kingdom does a Messiah bring about? Well, he's been showing that to us all along. But still the question remains, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? What right does he have? We even see that question here. What right does he have to do the things that he's been doing? The truth about who he is laid out for us in Mark's gospel. So I want to talk about who is this guy. We have to start in this chapter by talking about this challenge and the curse that he lays upon the fig tree. To understand this part of chapter 11, I think we really have to get into the mindset of an ancient Israelite, of a first century Israelite, particularly Jesus' mindset. And one way to do that is to use our imagination. So I want to do that together this morning. I want us to imagine together for a little bit. Imagine the largest, most important building in our country. Okay? Just spend a moment thinking about that. Imagine the largest, most important building in our country. And that could be several different buildings that we all might be thinking about. But it should be one that has significant historical importance, right? It should be one where famous people go there because it's important to go to that building, to visit there, to be asked to visit that place. It should be where iconic people have gone, where we could go back and look at photos of, ooh, when that person was in that place. That was important, right? That building should be like that. Continue to imagine that place in your mind. It should also be a place that symbolizes deep meaning for our country, right? A place that, if it were removed, that would be a significant loss for our country. Everybody imagining a building right now? Okay. With that mental image in your mind, begin to imagine that you were utterly convinced, beyond all reasonable doubt at all, that that building was about to be destroyed. That perhaps an earthquake was going to destroy it. Perhaps a foreign enemy was going to topple it. Imagine that you were so convinced about this, you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was going to happen. And imagine that the destruction of that building was God's purpose for it. You are convinced of this. You have no doubt that this is what God has planned for this building. And then imagine that you feel obligated to tell every single person you can, here's what's coming. Here's the sign of what's about to happen. Unless we imagine that sort of scenario, I don't think we can truly understand what Jesus is doing and talking about in this moment in chapter 11. Because I think that's precisely the sort of scenario that Jesus himself is in. He sees before him the temple. He knows beyond the shadow of a doubt that God has planned destruction for him. It makes him weep openly. We see that in the Gospels. That Jesus himself is distraught, that the truth of this destruction is coming. And so what does he do? He performs a sign act to show them the error of their ways, hoping beyond all hope that it won't happen. In the midst of this, we have the cursing of the fig tree. Some of you are probably wondering, get to the fig tree already. I want to know about the fig tree. Let's talk about the fig tree. Because it seems rather odd what happened, right? You read the story of the fig tree and you go, Jesus did something weird there. What are we supposed to do with the fig tree? And why on earth curse a fig tree that isn't producing fruit out of season? I mean, that's like walking up to a peach tree right now and going, well, nobody's ever getting peaches off this one again. Well, of course not. It's not peach season. We all know where peaches come from. The best peaches. So what is going on with the cursing of the fig tree? What could Jesus mean by doing this? Was he being impatient? Was he being petty? Was he just out of touch with the cycle of seasons and when figs are supposed to be growing on the trees? No, I don't think it's any of those things. I think the truth is, Mark has arranged this perfectly for us. You'd probably notice that we get half of the fig tree story before Jesus goes to the temple. As they're leaving the next day, we get the second half of the fig tree story. And so the question is, why does Mark structure the narrative in this way? Why part of it before and part of it after? I believe that what Mark is doing is he is signaling to us that what happened in the temple is explained by what he did with the fig tree, and vice versa. What he did with the fig tree is explained by what he did in the temple. In other words, he is acting out a dramatic parable. This is not unique to Jesus. He wasn't the only great teacher and thinker who acted out parables for his students so they could learn what he was trying to teach them. The temple had become like the fig tree. Now, what's going on with the fig tree in this moment? It has lots of leaves, but what doesn't it have? Fruits. It's not producing anything helpful. And so Jesus moves on to the temple and does what? Sweeps it clean, because they're not producing anything fruitful. the place that should be producing the most fruit in Israel, the place where people ought to be able to come to be fed, to be nourished, to feed on God's Word, literally to have the fruit of God in their lives, is a place with no fruit. The parable of, or the reality of cursing the fig tree, is this acted out parable that Jesus is teaching to say that's precisely what's going on in the temple. God's temple was intended to signify God's dwelling with His people, but not just for His people, but for the sake of the whole world. If you go back to the promise to Abraham, what did he say? That all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your children. Instead, the temple had become a symbol of a very narrow, very hard-hearted, and hard-minded religion and politics of the time. And the truth is, many of those people who were at the top of Israelite society viewed themselves merely as the good people, and everybody else was lower and lesser than they were. In other words, it had become a symbol of exclusion, a symbol of, we have it figured out, you don't, and you have no part in what we do. And so Jesus' disruption of the sacrificial system, which is precisely what He did by turning over the tables, by driving out those who were exchanging and selling the animals, which, to be honest, was a very common and needed practice. I mean, imagine that you live many miles away and you come to offer a sacrifice. It can be difficult to travel with an animal. Anybody ever traveled with an animal? Children count. If you've ever traveled with children or animals, they count. It's difficult, right? Now imagine you're doing that on foot. The animal doesn't want to go where you want to go, but you got to carry it nonetheless, or you have to drive it with you, right? You got to make it go where you want to go. That's a difficult thing to do. What's easier? Well, let me travel to Jerusalem. I can do that in half the time that it's going to take for me to do it with an animal, and I'll buy one at the temple because I know that they sell animals that are specifically there to be offered as sacrifices. That makes a lot of sense. I don't think Jesus is upset at the very practice of it. I think what He's upset about is that they must have been charging exorbitant prices, right? They must have been in some way profiting off of this. And that is not the function of the priesthood or the Levites. They're not there to profit off the people. They are there to mediate between God and the people. And they had planted themselves right there to profit off of this sacrificial system. So Jesus disrupts that. He says there's no fruit here. There's nothing going on here that's a blessing to the people. And doing this for even a short time, coupled with His words of condemnation and the actions that He takes there, I think make clear the disgust that He had for what they were doing. It's also important to recognize His anger. I think Jesus was angry in this moment. It's important to recognize His anger that the one place in the world that ought to be a beacon of light and of hope, remember that light on the hill that Jesus talks about? That's supposed to be the temple. Instead, He declares that it's us, again, because the temple wasn't fulfilling that role. This one place that's supposed to be a beacon of hope for the world had instead become the opposite of that. The truth is, what was happening in the temple ought to encourage us, ought to challenge us. Think about the ways that people view our churches. We sit up on a hill, much like the temple in Jerusalem. Is our church known as a beacon of hope? Is our church a light to other people? That happens because of us. Do we present a message of hope and of light, gospel to other people? In other words, Are we like the fig tree, not producing very much fruit? Would Jesus do the same sort of thing in our midst that He did at the temple so many years ago? Would He curse a tree around us to perform that act as a way to condemn our own worship? Those sorts of questions ought to be at the forefront of our mind when we read a passage like this. It's one thing to sit back and say, yeah, of course He condemned the temple. Look at all the terrible things that were going on there. But you know the saying, when you're pointing at somebody, what's happening? You got 3 fingers pointing back at you, right? Far be it from us to think that Jesus was only talking about the temple at that time. What do we need to hear from this story? And then notice toward the end there, he has this instruction about prayer. It almost seems out of place in this moment. But Jesus knew precisely the cause He was passing on to His disciples. He'd already told them that they are the light of the world, right? We talked about that. The new temple where the light shines is them. And Paul picks up on this language later on in his letter to the churches. It's no longer to be found in a temple. The Holy Spirit will now reside within people. That charge, that endeavor, could only and can still only be taken up with prayer. If you have a hope, if you believe or think that you can do this thing called life as a Christian without prayer, you are sorely mistaken. The expectation, we talked about this in our upstairs class a few weeks ago. The expectation is that you will pray. Just go back and read Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, when you pray. Not if you pray, not you might get around to it, not it'd be a good thing to do, but you don't really have to. No, the expectation is that you will pray. The only way we can do this life, the only way we can be a beacon of hope, a light on a hill, is if we take up our lives in prayer. And so directly linked with prayer is forgiveness. Now, that's not something we tend to think about or talk about a lot. We don't tend to put those two things together, that prayer and forgiveness go together. We tend to make prayer all about us, right? Prayer is very personal. It's about me. When I go to God in prayer, I want to talk about my stuff. I want to talk about what's going on with me. I want God to help me out with the situation in my life. Maybe we devote a little bit of time to intercessory prayer for other people, but it's mostly about me. But what does Jesus say in this moment? If you want to ask for forgiveness, what do you need to do? You need to be a forgiving person. And this is a hard teaching. I struggle with forgiveness sometimes. Maybe you're like me. Maybe you struggle with forgiveness as well. I don't know how to overcome that, except by prayer. I don't know how to be a more forgiving person, except by asking God to show me, to teach me what it looks like to be a forgiving person. If you want forgiveness, you must be forgiving. And so we see this integral link between prayer and forgiveness. Again, one that I don't think we talk about a whole lot. So the challenge, right, really two challenges here. We have the curse and really two challenges. One challenge is to make our place of worship a place that bears fruit. The other is to be a people of forgiveness. And then the second thing I want to talk about is, could John, and here I mean John the Baptist, have actually been right? That's the question that the religious teachers are bringing before Jesus. Imagine with me again for a moment. Imagine you're a firefighter, okay? You've been at the job for about 20 years or so, a couple of decades, so you're good at it. You know what you're doing, right? You show up to a scene, you know what you're supposed to do. You've been trained thoroughly and extensively trained. You know precisely the right procedures to take. While you're at the station one day, you receive a call. There's a big fire. They need just about everybody from the city to respond to the fire. All units should converge on this place to put it out. And by the time you arrive, there are like 8, 10 other trucks there. Everybody's raring to go, ready to respond. As you set up to begin, you see a man. A young man. He's just dressed in plain clothes. He doesn't have the proper equipment on. He's not wearing the right uniform. He's just dressed in plain clothes. And he walks up to you and all of your colleagues just from across the street. And he begins to direct you. He begins to tell you what you need to do to put out the fire the appropriate way. Right? He's telling you to go here and your other people to go there. And here's where you need to work first to put it out properly. And then he starts directing the other people. Right? The crowd. Because obviously there's going to be a crowd. If there's a big fire, people want to come see it. So there's a crowd. Now he starts telling the crowd what to do. Right? He's directing the firefighters. He's directing the crowd. He's telling them to stay back and where to stand and all this kind of stuff. He just inserts himself right in the middle of your job. You know your job better than he does. He's dressed in plain clothes. You've got the uniform on. You've got the right equipment. Who is he to step in and tell you how to do your job? And after the fire has been contained, he tries to walk away. He's just going to mosey on back through the crowd and go on about his life. How dare he do that? Who does he think he is, stepping into your job, telling you what to do? I mean, is he trying to upstage you and your colleagues? Is he trying to make himself better? That's probably what it is. He wants to be the hero. What gives him the right to insert himself? And he even had the audacity to tell the crowds what to do, as though he understands how to, help people in this situation. Do you kind of get the mood of that imagination? That's the mood of the second part here in chapter 11. The religious authorities view Jesus as that young man. Now, they're not firefighters, of course, but they put out fires, so to speak, right? Religious and political and social fires, they put those out. They've been putting them out for years, hundreds of years, not just a couple decades, for hundreds of years. They have run the show. They know what they're doing. Because they were trained by so-and-so, who was trained by so-and-so, who was trained by so-and-so, and on. And they've got a pedigree a mile long. They know what they're doing. How dare this young upstart guy from Galilee insert himself into our job? He's telling people how to act. We tell people how to act. He's trying to put out the fires that we try to put out. No way. We know what we're doing. He has no training. He doesn't wear the right clothes. He tells people what to do. Who is he? How dare he speak on behalf of God? That's their job. They know what they're doing. Of course, as the readers, we all know the truth about this young man, this young upstart who presumes to know so much about the ways of God. We know him to be the true Messiah, the true King of the Jews. And the question Jesus asks the religious leaders is very challenging. Not because the answer isn't obvious to anyone who's read the story like we have, right? The answer that Jesus asks is very obvious to us. It's challenging because they immediately recognize the conundrum that he's put them in, right? Based on the answer that they give, they know that they're in a pickle immediately. But the depth of what he's asking them, they can only guess at. It's not just that accepting John's authority as from heaven would put them in a place to be asked, well, then why didn't you believe John? Right? That's part of it. But Jesus was, in fact, the very one that John had said, we're waiting on him. Right? Yes, I'm doing good things, but I'm waiting for somebody better. I'm waiting for the one that I'm not even worthy to get down and untie his sandals. I'm not even worthy to touch his feet. That's how low I am compared to this other person who's coming after. Jesus was so far greater than John could ever be. So if they now admitted John's authority was from heaven, then they would, tacitly, whether they knew it or not, be agreeing with John that Jesus was, in fact, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Whether they knew it or not, if they agreed that John's message was from heaven, his baptism was from heaven, they would have to be agreeing that Jesus is the Lamb of God. And additionally, they would be agreeing with the voice on the Mount of Transfiguration that proclaimed him, "This is my beloved Son," who also spoke at the time of his baptism. Jesus' question to them is beyond their understanding. It's beyond their ability to understand because they're blind to who he is. And it's ironic what we see here in the last part of chapter 11. If you look back earlier on in Mark's gospel, what had drawn the crowds to Jesus? It wasn't his miracles. If you go back and you read Mark, he doesn't say it's because he was performing such great feats. It wasn't even because he was teaching such great messages. They were drawn to him because of his authority. If you go back and you read Mark, that's what he says. People are drawn to him because he speaks so authoritatively, because he acts with such authority. And yet now, what's getting him in trouble? His authority. The religious leaders are looking at him going, he shouldn't have any authority. Who does he think he is? It was okay when he was out in the country. It was okay when he was out in Poduntville. We could ignore him then. But now where has he come? He's come to their home turf. It's like in a sports game, you talked about the home field advantage. A lot of people talk about that. That's what the religious leaders thought they had in Jerusalem. They were at home. That's their territory. When he was out there, that's okay, but now he's come here. Now he's encroaching on our space and our time, trying to tell us how to do our job. And so Jesus can be ignored no longer. He can be ignored no longer. And this event, this moment, leads to his death. And of course, they fail to recognize that the place where they believe they have authority, the place that they are calling their space, their home field advantage, I have no idea. I have no idea that it's really his house, because it's God's house. The irony in this story is just dripping off. It's just oozing out. And I love it. There's a lot to take from Mark 11. But we're going to conclude this morning with a couple of questions to think about. The first one, which we kind of talked about earlier, are our churches places where love, acceptance, and forgiveness happen? Or are they places of exclusion, like the temple was? Whether right or wrong, people perceive Christians in a certain way. They perceive us in a certain way. Some of that perception is based in the fact that at times, as Christians, we haven't been very forgiving. We haven't acted lovingly toward people. We haven't been accepting of the fact that they're sinners, but guess what? So are we. So how do we make our churches places where that happens? Because sometimes it feels like we're the temple all over again. Sometimes it feels like our churches are places where we talk about the right things. So we've got a lot of leaves on the trees, but maybe there's no fruit to be plucked here. How do we make sure that we are the beacon of hope, the light of the world? Because that's precisely what Jesus declares that we are. And the second thing is, do we trust Jesus on His own authority? Now, this is a tough one. Because sometimes we get in this, we begin to ask ourselves the question, who is this guy? Is he really claiming to be God? And how do I deal with that? How do I go about really believing that Jesus is God's Son. How do I make that true for me? As we read through Mark's Gospel, do we trust Jesus? Do we read His words and see His actions and observe how He lives and know that He is God and the blessing that He is to us and therefore that we can and should be to others? There's good news in Mark chapter 11. I love this chapter, and I hope that as we've looked at it this morning that maybe there's been a little bit of clarity for you about some confusing things that are in chapter 11, particularly the fig tree story. That's one that I find a lot of people get to and they go, I don't know what to do with this. This one's really weird. And it is. Until you understand the style of Mark and what he's doing by sandwiching, by making that story a sandwich about the temple and the fruit there. So as we leave today, what do we need to change about our lives? What kind of fruit are we bearing, if any? And what does it look like to be better fruit bearers for God? If you have a need, we're going to have family time right now. Family time is time where we get together for whatever need you may have that we need to pray for, to be encouraging about, to lift you up, and to help carry burdens that you may have. That's what we want to do for you this morning. So whatever it may be that you have, let us know about it as we stand and sing.